Carlo Gambino died in his bed. That single fact, unremarkable on its surface, extraordinary in its context, is the most precise summary of what he built and how completely he built it. He was 74 years old. He was watching the Yankees on television at his home in Massapequa, Long Island. He had a heart attack and he died, quietly, in the house where he had lived for years, surrounded by his family, in the autumn of 1976. The FBI had been investigating him for 30 years. They had wiretapped him, surveilled him, subpoenaed him, and placed informants in his proximity for 3 consecutive decades. They had built cases, assembled evidence, and prepared prosecutions. None of it reached him. None of it touched him. He arrived in America in 1921 as a 20-year-old Sicilian with nothing. He died as the most powerful organized crime figure this country has ever produced. He was never convicted of a violent crime. He ordered hundreds of them. This is the story of the Gambino family, and it begins, the way all the best American stories begin, on a boat. Carlo Gambino was born on August 24, 1902, in Palermo, Sicily, in the neighborhood of Caccamo, a district whose social architecture was governed not by the formal institutions of Italian civic life, but by the parallel authority structure that had been managing Sicilian existence since before the Italian state existed. He was born into a family with Mafia connections that were not peripheral biographical detail but structural fact. The Gambinos and the Castellanos, the family into which Carlo would eventually marry, were connected families in the Sicilian sense of the term, meaning their relationships were defined by blood, obligation, and the specific code of loyalty that the Mafia's social architecture maintained across generations. He grew up watching how power actually worked in Palermo. Not the official version, the courts, the carabinieri, the municipal government, but the real version. The men who resolved disputes, the men whose word settled matters that the law could not reach, the men to whom other men came with problems and left with solutions, and who remembered every favor and every debt with a precision that no written ledger could have matched. He absorbed this understanding the way a child absorbs language, not through explicit instruction, but through immersion in an environment where the rules were visible in every interaction he witnessed. He was inducted into the Sicilian Mafia before he left Sicily. The specific date and circumstances of his initiation were never established in any legal proceeding, but the fact of his membership in the Palermo Mafia structure before his emigration was confirmed by multiple sources in the subsequent decades of American investigation into his activities. He came to America not as a man seeking to escape organized crime, but as a man whose organized crime credentials were the most significant professional qualification he carried across the Atlantic. He arrived in New York in 1921, traveling on a fake passport, a detail that would have been unremarkable among the hundreds of thousands of Sicilian immigrants who had preceded him, except that in Gambino's case it reflected not desperation but calculation. He had made a deliberate choice to come to America without documentation, entering the country outside the formal immigration process. He would remain, for the entirety of his American life, technically in the country illegally, a fact that federal prosecutors would eventually identify as a potential deportation mechanism, and that Gambino's lawyers would spend years fighting. He settled in Brooklyn, in the dense Sicilian immigrant community centered around Carroll Gardens and Red Hook, where the social architecture of the old country had been reconstructed with the specific adaptations required by the new one. The men he connected with in Brooklyn were men he knew, or men who knew men he knew. The chain of Sicilian personal connection that functioned as the Mafia's organizational nervous system regardless of geographic location. He found work. He learned English with the methodical patience that characterized every significant undertaking of his life. He watched. The Brooklyn of the early 1920s was a landscape of criminal opportunity of a kind that Sicily had never offered. Prohibition had arrived in January 1920, and the elimination of legal alcohol had created an economic void whose scale dwarfed anything that the traditional mafia revenue streams of the old country, the agricultural extortion, the dispute resolution fees, the tribute from legitimate businesses, had ever produced. The men who could fill that void with supply adequate to the demand were going to accumulate wealth at a pace the Sicilian Mafia's founders had never imagined. Carlo Gambino understood this with the clarity of a man who had been trained from childhood to identify where power actually resided and to position himself in relationship to it. He began as a truck driver for the bootlegging operations that the D'Aquila family, one of the 5 organized crime families that were in the process of consolidating control of New York's Italian criminal networks, was running through Brooklyn. He was reliable, discreet, and possessed of a quality that would define his entire career. He never drew attention to himself when attention was not useful to him. In an environment full of men who confused visibility with power, Carlo Gambino was building power through invisibility. He was learning the business from the inside, accumulating knowledge about operations, relationships, and vulnerabilities, and waiting with a patience that most of the men around him did not possess and could not understand. He was 20 years old. He had 30 years of waiting ahead of him. And at the end of those 30 years, every man who had been ahead of him would be dead. The New York organized crime world that Carlo Gambino entered in 1921 was in the middle of a structural transformation whose violence would eventually clear the path for everything he subsequently built. The men who ran the Italian criminal networks in New York in the early 1920s were the mustache Petis, the old country Sicilian bosses, who had brought their methods and their hierarchies intact from the island, and had transplanted them with minimal adaptation into the American urban environment. Salvatore D'Aquila, Nicola Schiro, the Morello family, whose long decline from their peak Black Hand-era power had been accelerating since the 1909 federal counterfeiting prosecution. These were men of genuine organizational capability who had built functioning criminal structures in the most competitive criminal environment in the world. They were also men whose fundamental orientation toward Sicily, toward the old country's codes and relationships and grudges, was producing a rigidity that the next generation of American-born and American-raised Italian criminals found increasingly limiting. The Castellammarese War of 1930 and 1931 was the decisive violence. It was not a war in the conventional sense. There was no formal declaration, no defined front, no single battle that decided its outcome. It was a sustained series of killings, betrayals, shifting alliances, and accumulated murders that ultimately eliminated the old leadership structure and created the organizational space in which the modern American Mafia was built. Giuseppe Masseria, Joe the Boss, the most powerful single figure in the New York Italian criminal world through the late 1920s, was shot dead in a Coney Island restaurant on April 15, 1931, by 4 men sent by his own most trusted lieutenant, Charles Lucky Luciano, who had already arranged his own protection with the opposing faction. Salvatore Maranzano, who had been Masseria's primary rival throughout the war, and who declared himself capo di tutti capi in the aftermath. was murdered 6 months later in his Park Avenue office by men sent by Luciano, who had correctly identified Maranzano's ambitions as the next obstacle to his own dominance. Carlo Gambino's position through the Castellammarese War was one of careful alignment. He had attached himself to the Mafia faction early in his American career, but he read the direction of the conflict with the accuracy that would characterize his political judgments for the next 40 years. He did not make himself a visible target for the opposing side. He did not make himself so central to Mafia's operations that his loyalty to Mafia's cause would be held against him when Mafia was gone. He occupied, throughout the war's violence, exactly the position that a man of his patience and his intelligence would have chosen, close enough to the center of power to accumulate knowledge and relationships, far enough from its most dangerous expressions to survive them. The organizational structure that Lucky Luciano established in the aftermath of the Castellammarese War became the architecture of American organized crime for the rest of the 20th century. 5 families in New York, each with defined leadership, territory, and revenue streams. A commission, a coordinating body of family bosses, to resolve disputes and authorize major decisions. A formal hierarchy within each family: boss, underboss, consigliere, capos, soldiers, associates. Rules governing conduct: the prohibition on killing law enforcement, the prohibition on dealing directly in narcotics, the requirement of commission approval for the killing of a made member. The rules were regularly violated, but their existence provided a framework that distinguished the organization from mere criminal chaos and gave it the institutional durability that no simple gang could have maintained. Gambino became a soldier in the family of Vincent Mangano, one of the 5 bosses established by the post-war reorganization. Mangano ran his family with a conservatism that matched Gambino's own temperament: careful, deliberate, more interested in revenue than in profile. Gambino rose steadily within the Mangano family structure, becoming a capo, a captain commanding a crew of soldiers, by the late 1930s. He expanded his operations into labor racketeering, loansharking, and the garment industry connections that would eventually make the family's Manhattan operations among the most lucrative in the city. His relationship with Albert Anastasia, the Mangano family's underboss, a man of extraordinary violence who had served as the primary operational head of Murder Inc., the enforcement arm used by the Commission to carry out authorized killings, was the most consequential of his career's early period. Anastasia and Gambino were allies, their relationship sealed by the marriage of their families. Gambino married Catherine Castellano, whose brother Paul would eventually succeed Gambino as boss, and the web of family and organizational connections that Gambino systematically built around himself created a network of obligation and mutual interest that provided both protection and operational depth. In April 1951, Vincent Mangano and his brother Philip disappeared. Their bodies were never found. Vincent Mangano was never seen again. Philip Mangano's body turned up in a marsh in Brooklyn. Albert Anastasia appeared before the commission and explained that Mangano had been plotting to kill him. A claim that, under Mafia rules governing the justification for killing a superior, provided sufficient cover for the commission to ratify what had already happened. The commission accepted Anastasia's account. Anastasia became the boss of what would eventually be known as the Gambino family. Gambino became his underboss. The partnership between Anastasia and Gambino was the partnership of 2 men whose temperaments were almost perfectly opposed, and whose opposition made them, together, more formidable than either would have been separately. Anastasia was impulsive, violent and operationally aggressive in ways that generated both revenue and problems. Gambino was measured, patient, and politically attuned in ways that managed the problems Anastasia's aggression created. Anastasia made things happen. Gambino made sure that what happened did not bring the organization down. But Anastasia's aggression eventually made him a problem that even Gambino could not manage. His willingness to order killings without commission approval, his expansion into Cuban casino operations that created conflict with other commission members, and his increasingly erratic behavior generated opposition across the organization that Gambino, with his customary patience, had been quietly supporting rather than suppressing. On October 25, 1957, Albert Anastasia sat down in the barber chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel barbershop in Midtown Manhattan. Two men entered the barbershop, pushed the barber aside, and shot Anastasia 10 times at close range. He died in the barber chair, knocked to the floor by the force of the shots, still wrapped in the white barber's cape. His killer or killers were never prosecuted. Carlo Gambino became the boss of the family that now bore his name. He was 55 years old, had been in America for 36 years, and had never been convicted of anything more serious than a tax charge. The careful, patient, invisible man from Palermo had finally reached the position he had been moving toward, with the methodical deliberateness of a chess player who had planned his game from the opening move. He would hold that position for 19 years, and in those 19 years he would build something that no amount of federal pressure, no amount of prosecution, and no amount of internal betrayal could fully destroy. An organizational architecture so durable that it continued generating power and revenue for decades after the man who designed it was in the ground. The first thing people who met Carlo Gambino always remarked upon was how little he resembled what they expected. He was small, 5'7", thin, with a prominent nose and large ears that gave his face an almost comical expressiveness in photographs. He dressed without ostentation. He drove modest cars. He lived in a house in Massapequa that was comfortable without being the kind of visible wealth display that would have attracted the wrong kind of attention. He attended Mass. He doted on his grandchildren. He sat on the stoop of his Brooklyn social club in the evening and played cards with men he had known for decades. The FBI agents who surveilled him found him, in his daily routines, almost impossible to build a case around. He did not conduct business on the telephone. He met people in person. In locations, he varied constantly, and he communicated in ways that left no documentary trace. He rarely gave direct orders in language that could be converted into evidence. He communicated through implication, through relationship, through the shared understanding that 20 years of organizational leadership had built between him and every significant figure in his organization. A look was sufficient. A nod was an instruction. The absence of any reaction to a proposed course of action was understood by the men who worked for him as approval. He had made himself, as a communications target, essentially invisible to the surveillance technology, available to law enforcement through the 1950s, 1960s, and into the 1970s. This was not paranoia. It was discipline, the same discipline he had brought to every dimension of his organizational life. Gambino understood, with a clarity that many of his contemporaries never achieved, that the primary vulnerability of a criminal organization was not its enemies, but its own communications. Every word spoken on a telephone was a potential exhibit. Every meeting in a public place was a potential surveillance photograph. Every explicit instruction given to a subordinate was a potential witness testimony. He structured his entire operational existence around the elimination of those vulnerabilities, and he did it so completely and so consistently that the FBI, across 3 decades of active investigation, was never able to build a prosecutable case around his actual criminal activities. His management style matched his communications discipline. He did not micromanage. He identified capable men, placed them in positions where their capabilities could generate revenue, and held them accountable for results without requiring detailed reporting about methods. His capos, the captains who commanded the family's individual crews, operated with significant operational autonomy within the strategic framework he established. They paid their tribute upward, maintained their crew's discipline, kept their operations from generating the kind of attention that would bring law enforcement pressure on the family as a whole, and resolved disputes within their territories without escalating to a level that required his personal intervention. When they failed at any of these requirements, the consequences were clear and consistent. He did not make threats. He made decisions. His political intelligence was the quality that most distinguished him from every other organized crime boss of his generation. He understood the Commission not as an authority above him to be obeyed, but as a political instrument to be managed. He built alliances on the Commission with the same patience he had brought to building alliances within his own family, cultivating relationships, providing assistance, calling in favors at moments calculated to maximize the return on the political investment. He was never the loudest voice in any commission discussion. He was frequently the decisive one. The relationship with Meyer Lansky illustrated his political range. Lansky, the Jewish organized crime figure whose financial sophistication had made him the architect of the National Crime Syndicate's offshore financial infrastructure, was not a made member of any Italian family and had no formal organizational standing in the Commission's structure. But his control over the financial systems that processed the Commission family's casino revenues gave him a practical power that organizational charts did not reflect. Gambino maintained a working relationship with Lansky that was based on mutual recognition of each other's actual power rather than their formal positions. This was characteristic. Gambino consistently identified where power actually resided and built his relationships around that reality, rather than around the formal hierarchy that the organization's rules described. His relationship with the Castellano family, cemented by his marriage to Catherine Castellano, created the dynastic dimension of his organizational strategy. He was not simply building a criminal enterprise. He was building a family empire in the traditional Sicilian sense, an intergenerational structure of blood, marriage, and organizational connection that would sustain itself across the transition between his leadership and whoever came next. His cousin Paul Castellano, who would eventually succeed him as boss, was not selected solely on the basis of organizational capability. He was selected because he was family, because his elevation preserved the dynastic continuity that Gambino considered essential to the organization's long-term stability. This dynastic thinking was both the greatest strength and the most consequential weakness of what Gambino built. The strength was obvious. The family connections provided a depth of trust and mutual obligation that purely organizational relationships could not replicate, and that trust provided a measure of protection against the informant penetration that would eventually destroy what came after. The weakness was equally obvious in retrospect. By selecting his successor on the basis of family connection rather than organizational capability, Gambino made the kind of error that every dynastic institution eventually makes. He chose continuity over competence, and the consequences of that choice took less than a decade after his death to become catastrophic. But in the years of his actual leadership, the 19 years between Anastasia's death in the barber chair and his own quiet end in front of the television, Carlo Gambino built something that genuinely deserves the word empire. Not in the theatrical sense that the word is applied to organized crime figures who control a few neighborhoods and some gambling operations. In the structural sense, an organization with sufficient revenue, sufficient political protection, sufficient internal discipline, and sufficient institutional memory to sustain itself through decades of external pressure and internal conflict. A criminal institution with the properties that distinguish durable institutions from temporary ones: distributed authority, multiple revenue streams, accumulated relationships with legitimate business and political structures, and an organizational culture that prioritized the collective survival over any individual's ambition. He built it quietly, he maintained it quietly, and when the time came, he tried, with the same deliberateness he had brought to everything else, to transfer it quietly to the next generation. He almost succeeded. The Gambino family's revenue operations at the peak of Gambino's leadership were not the kind of dramatic, visible criminal enterprises that newspaper coverage and popular imagination associated with organized crime. They were institutional, embedded in the legitimate economic structures of New York City at a depth that made them, from the outside, almost indistinguishable from normal commerce. The garment district was the most significant single revenue source. New York's 7th Avenue fashion industry in the 1950s and 1960s was among the most concentrated economic sectors in the city. A dense cluster of manufacturers, designers, truckers, and retailers operating in a geographic area of a few city blocks and generating revenues that dwarfed most industries of comparable physical footprint. The Gambino family's penetration of this industry was accomplished through labor racketeering, the control of the unions that represented the industry's workers and the trucking companies that moved its product, control of the Teamsters locals that managed garment district trucking, gave the family effective authority over which businesses could operate without disruption, and which businesses found their deliveries delayed, their drivers unavailable, their shipments mysteriously misdirected. The tribute payments that garment district businesses made to maintain operational continuity were not voluntary in any meaningful sense. They were the cost of doing business in a sector where the cost of not paying was higher than the cost of paying. Gambino family control of garment district operations at its peak generated tens of millions of dollars annually, a revenue stream that was, from a prosecutorial standpoint, extraordinarily difficult to attack because the formal union structures through which control was exercised were legal entities whose corruption was embedded several layers below the surface that investigators could easily reach. The waterfront was equally significant. New York Harbor in the mid-20th century was the busiest port complex in the world, the point through which an enormous fraction of American imports and exports moved, and through which, consequently, the revenues of everyone from shipping companies to longshoremen to the businesses depending on reliable cargo movement were distributed. The International Longshoremen's Association, which represented the port's workers, had been under organized crime influence since the early decades of the century. Gambino family control of key ILA locals gave the family a position on the waterfront that provided both direct revenue, tribute payments, no-show jobs, kickbacks on contracts, and strategic leverage over commerce whose scale was difficult to overstate. A family that controlled who worked the docks in New York Harbor controlled, in practice, the movement of goods. Through the most important commercial gateway in the country, the construction industry provided a third major revenue stream, whose mechanics were slightly different from the labor racketeering model, but whose results were similarly consistent. New York City's construction industry in the post-war decades was a massive economic sector. The city was rebuilding, expanding, and developing at a pace that generated contract volumes running into the billions of dollars annually. The family's penetration of construction operated through a combination of union control, concrete cartel participation, and bid-rigging arrangements that ensured family-connected contractors won the most lucrative public and private contracts. The concrete cartel, an arrangement that divided the New York metropolitan construction market among a small group of concrete suppliers, all of whom maintained organized crime relationships, was eventually dismantled by federal prosecution in the 1980s. But during its operational years, it generated revenues sufficient to sustain multiple families simultaneously. Loansharking operated as the retail layer beneath the institutional revenue streams. The family's crew-level operations maintained extensive loansharking books, portfolios of usurious loans to individuals and businesses who could not access conventional credit, at interest rates that typically ran between 3 and 5% per week. The enforcement mechanism was the credible threat of violence against borrowers who fell behind on payments, and the threat was credible because it was occasionally demonstrated. Loansharking was labor-intensive, operationally visible, and more legally vulnerable than the institutional revenue streams because it required direct contact between crew members and clients in ways that generated witnesses, documentary evidence, and the occasional desperate borrower willing to cooperate with investigators. But it was also extraordinarily profitable at the crew level, and it served a financial function in the criminal economy, providing capital to small businesses and individuals on terms no bank would offer. That generated a genuine customer base rather than merely a captive one. Gambling operations, numbers running, sports betting, card games provided the most consistent and broadly distributed revenue at the street level. The numbers game in particular was a deeply embedded institution in New York's working class and immigrant neighborhoods. A daily lottery operated at the block level, generating small individual wagers that aggregated to substantial revenues across the family's territory. The family did not run numbers operations directly at the retail level. It franchised them, collecting a percentage of gross revenue from independent operators who ran their own books in exchange for the family's protection and organizational support. The franchise model was efficient, scalable, and reduced the family's direct exposure to prosecution by placing the most legally vulnerable element of the operation, the retail collection of wagers, in the hands of operators who were not formal members of the organization. The commission relationships that Gambino managed through his 19 years as boss provided both revenue-sharing opportunities and strategic protection against the kind of internal conflict that had destroyed organizational structures in the past. His relationship with the Genovese family, the other dominant force in New York organized crime during his tenure, was the most important. The Genovese family under Frank Costello and subsequently under Vito Genovese himself was the organization whose power most closely matched Gambino's own, and whose cooperation was therefore most essential to the commission's stability. Gambino's management of this relationship balancing cooperation with the maintenance of his own family's independence and revenue position demonstrated the political sophistication that made him, in the view of observers, both inside and outside the organization, the most capable criminal administrator of his generation. His position on the commission solidified after the Appalachian meeting debacle of November 1957, the gathering of organized crime figures from across the country at the upstate New York estate of Joseph Barbara that was discovered by local law enforcement, producing a list of attendees that confirmed the existence of a national organized crime structure in ways that congressional and law enforcement investigators had been trying to establish for years. The Appalachian exposure produced intense federal investigative pressure and a period of heightened scrutiny that forced the commission to reduce its meeting frequency and alter its communication patterns. Gambino's response to the post-Appalachian environment was characteristic. He became more cautious, more opaque, and more politically attentive to the management of the Commission's relationships with law enforcement and political structures that could provide protection or create vulnerability. His relationship with J. Edgar Hoover's FBI was shaped by a structural irony that subsequent historians have documented extensively. Hoover spent the 1950s publicly insisting that a national organized crime syndicate did not exist, a position that served multiple institutional purposes for the FBI, but that required the Bureau to devote minimal investigative resources to the activity it was denying existed. The organized crime families that Hoover publicly dismissed as non-existent were, during this period, expanding their revenues, deepening their institutional connections, and building the organizational depth that made them significantly harder to prosecute when federal attention eventually shifted toward them in earnest. By the time Robert Kennedy's Justice Department made organized crime a prosecutorial priority in the early 1960s, and the FBI's institutional position shifted to match, the families had 20 years of organizational consolidation behind them that underfunded and strategically misdirected prosecution had never challenged. Gambino navigated the post-Hoover federal attention with the same combination of personal discipline and organizational management that had served him through the previous decades. He continued to avoid the communication patterns that produced prosecutable evidence. He adjusted his crew-level operations to reduce the visibility that federal surveillance could exploit. He managed the Commission's responses to federal pressure with the political intelligence that had established his leadership position there. And he waited, as he had always waited, with the specific patience of a man who understood that his most reliable asset was time, and that federal investigative attention, like most institutional enthusiasms, would eventually be redirected somewhere else. He was right. It always was, until it wasn't. The violence that sustained the Gambino empire was not the theatrical, spontaneous violence of street gangs or the retaliatory violence of turf wars fought in public. It was institutional violence, deliberate, authorized, and deployed with a specific communicative purpose rather than as an expression of personal anger or organizational aggression. Carlo Gambino ordered deaths the way a corporate executive authorizes capital expenditure, as a management decision taken after consideration of alternatives, intended to produce a specific organizational outcome. The murder of Albert Anastasia was the most significant single act of violence in Gambino's career, and its management illustrated his method. He had not ordered the killing directly. He had facilitated the political conditions in which others, Vito Genovese, who had his own reasons to want Anastasia gone, and the Profaci family, which had operational grievances, could organize and execute the killing with commission acquiescence rather than commission authorization. Gambino's role was the creation of the political environment in which the killing could happen without triggering the retaliatory response that an unauthorized murder of a sitting boss would normally have produced. He had not pulled a trigger or hired the men who did. He had arranged the context. The distinction was not merely semantic. It was the precise distinction between being an accessory to murder, which prosecutors might have been able to prove, and being a political architect of the conditions that produced a murder, which they could not. This pattern, the engineering of circumstances rather than the direct authorization of acts, characterized his approach to violence throughout his leadership. He understood that the evidentiary standard for conspiracy to commit murder required proof of his personal involvement in the planning or authorization of a specific killing. By maintaining the organizational distance that his communications discipline provided, and by working through multiple layers of intermediary, he consistently kept himself outside the provable perimeter of the specific acts his organization committed. The violence that the Gambino family deployed during his tenure was substantial in volume and systematic in purpose. Contract killings authorized by the commission or by family leadership to resolve disputes, eliminate threats, or enforce organizational discipline were a regular feature of the organization's operational life. The number of killings directly attributable to Gambino family authorization across his 19 years as boss has never been established with legal precision because the evidentiary record, constructed from informant testimony, surveillance, and the documentary residue of investigations, is partial by the nature of what investigations into this kind of activity can establish. Credible estimates assembled from the investigative records of the period place the number in the dozens. Some estimates go higher. The specific violence that federal investigators found most useful in building their eventual cases against family members was the retail-level violence, the beatings, the threats, and the occasional killings that crew members employed in the management of their loansharking and extortion operations. This violence was operationally necessary in the sense that the revenue streams it protected depended on the credible threat of enforcement, but it was also the violence most visible to potential witnesses and most likely to produce the cooperating victims and bystanders whose testimony was the primary raw material of organized crime prosecution. Gambino managed the tension between operationally necessary violence and prosecutorial vulnerability. Through crew-level discipline, capos were held accountable for controlling the violence in their territories to the level that was necessary without escalating to the level that attracted investigative attention. When crew members crossed that line, the consequences within the organization were swift and internal. Problems that became visible to law enforcement were problems that created organizational risk, and organizational risk was the one category of failure that Gambino did not forgive. The family's relationship with the wider culture of organized crime violence in New York was managed through commission relationships, and the specific protocols the commission maintained for governing inter-family conflict. The rule against killing, made members of other families without commission authorization, was one of the most consistently maintained rules in the commission's history because its violation risked exactly the kind of open inter-family warfare that had produced the Castellammarese War's destruction. Gambino enforced this rule within his own family and used it as a political instrument in commission discussions. positioning himself as the voice of organizational stability against the more aggressive impulses of bosses whose operational styles generated internal conflict that spilled over into external relationships. The murder of Joey Gallo in 1972, the maverick Brooklyn gangster whose relationships with black criminal organizations in the prison system and whose general disregard for traditional organized crime protocols had created ongoing organizational problems, illustrated the complexity of violence management in a commission environment. Gallo was shot in Umberto's Clam house in Little Italy in April 1972, killed by men whose organizational affiliation was never established to the satisfaction of any prosecutorial investigation. The killing had the character of an authorized commission response to a figure who had accumulated sufficient organizational enemies across sufficient organizational lines that his removal could be achieved without attribution. Whether Gambino's specific authorization was required or obtained was never established. That the killing was consistent with his organizational interests was not in dispute. The violence that eventually proved most consequential for the family's institutional survival was not the violence of the Gambino era, but the violence of what came after. Specifically, the killing of Paul Castellano in December 1985, which combined the most public and most unauthorized murder of a sitting boss in American organized crime history with the ascension of the man who would, through the specific combination of his ambition and his recklessness, deliver the Gambino family's operational leadership into the hands of federal prosecutors in a way that all of Gambino's care and discipline had spent 19 years preventing, but that came later. In the years of Gambino's actual leadership, the violence was managed, the revenues were generated, the institutional relationships were maintained, and the family remained, by every measurable standard, the most powerful and the most durable organized crime organization in the United States. Carlo Gambino died on October 15, 1976. He had been in declining health for several years, managing the family's affairs from a diminished physical position that his organizational authority still sustained without requiring his personal presence at the operational level. His succession decision, made well before his death and communicated through the channels of mutual understanding and implicit authority that governed all his significant communications, was the one decision of his career that most clearly reflected its fundamental limitation. Paul Castellano was 61 years old when he became the boss of the Gambino family. He was a large man, physically imposing, well-dressed, increasingly comfortable, with the visible trappings of the wealth his position had generated. He lived in a mansion on Staten Island, a property the press eventually dubbed the White House, that was equipped with the surveillance equipment the FBI would use to listen to his conversations, a surveillance operation that Castellano's willingness to conduct business at his home made possible in ways that Gambino's residential and operational discipline had never permitted. He was intelligent, organizationally capable, and genuinely effective as a business administrator of the family's legitimate and semi-legitimate operations. He was not, by temperament or by instinct, a man of the street in the way that the family's soldier-level culture required its leadership to represent. This disconnect between Castellano's corporate management style and the street-level culture that sustained the family's rank-and-file operations was the central tension of his 11-year tenure, and it was a tension that the men who eventually destroyed him identified, cultivated, and exploited with deliberate patience. Castellano's primary organizational interests were in the construction industry and the meat business, The legitimate economic sectors, where the family's institutional connections produced revenue through mechanisms that more closely resembled corporate management than street-level crime. He owned Skara Mix Concrete, which participated in the concrete cartel that controlled the New York construction market. He owned Dial Poultry, which processed chicken through a business connected to the family's waterfront operations. He managed these interests with the attention to organizational detail that he had developed over decades as a family executive, and he generated substantial revenues from them. Revenues that satisfied his personal financial requirements without requiring the kind of direct involvement in the street-level operations that he found aesthetically distasteful. The FBI's investigation of Castellano's operations benefited enormously from his residential habits. The Staten Island mansion served as both his home and his primary meeting location, the place where he received capos, associates, and the legitimate business figures whose relationships with the family he managed. The FBI, operating under the expanded wiretap authority that congressional legislation and Supreme Court decisions had developed through the 1970s, planted listening devices in the mansion and began accumulating an extraordinary archive of recorded conversations. Castellano spoke freely at home, in the confidence that what was said within his own walls was protected. It was not. The recordings produced evidence of a quality and specificity that no informant testimony could have matched, covering conversations about criminal operations, personnel decisions, financial arrangements, and the full range of organizational management that Castellano conducted from his kitchen table. The recordings captured not only organizational intelligence, but also Castellano's personal life, specifically his relationship with his housekeeper, Gloria Olarte, a Colombian woman who had become his romantic companion while his wife remained in the same house. The personal dimension of the recordings was organizationally significant, not because it was legally relevant to the criminal charges being built, but because it revealed to the men within the family who had access to its contents through their own informant relationships with the FBI, the degree to which Castellano had made himself vulnerable. A boss conducting criminal business conversations in his own home, while simultaneously conducting an extramarital relationship under the same roof, was a boss whose personal and professional judgment, the street-level culture of the family, found increasingly difficult to respect. The prosecutorial environment that Castellano faced was qualitatively different from anything his predecessor had navigated. The RICO statute, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, passed in 1970, had taken more than a decade to be deployed against organized crime with the full theoretical power its drafters had intended. By the early 1980s, federal prosecutors in the southern and eastern districts of New York had developed the case construction techniques and the judicial precedents necessary to use RICO as the instrument it had been designed to be. The statute allowed prosecutors to charge an entire criminal enterprise, not just individual acts by individual defendants, and to aggregate years of criminal conduct into a single prosecution whose scope and penalty exposure exceeded anything that could have been assembled under conventional criminal law. The Commission case, formerly United States v. Salerno, tried in 1986 and 1987, was the most consequential organized crime prosecution in American history. Federal prosecutors charged the bosses of all 5 New York organized crime families with conducting the affairs of the Commission as a criminal enterprise in violation of RICO. The evidence included surveillance recordings, informant testimony, and the documentary record of commission activities assembled through years of coordinated federal investigation. The defendants included Anthony Corallo of the Lucchese family, Gennaro Persico of the Colombo family, Anthony Salerno of the Genovese family, and, before his death in December 1985, Paul Castellano of the Gambino family. Castellano was murdered before the commission case came to trial. The murder removed him from the criminal proceedings, but it did not remove the Gambino family from the prosecutorial attention that the commission investigation had focused on New York organized crime. It simply replaced the defendant with a man whose subsequent conduct made the family's legal exposure significantly worse than anything Castellano's management, for all its vulnerabilities, would have produced. Paul Castellano was shot 6 times outside Spark Steakhouse on East 46th Street in Manhattan on December 16, 1985, as he arrived for a dinner meeting. His underboss Thomas Bilotti was killed alongside him. The men who carried out the killing were positioned across the street and around the corner. A coordinated shooting team deployed with operational precision that reflected significant planning. The man who watched from a car nearby, ensuring the killing was executed as planned before departing, was John Gotti. John Joseph Gotti Jr. was born on October 27, 1940, in the South Bronx, the 5th of 13 children, in a family that moved through several of New York's working-class neighborhoods during his childhood, before settling in Brooklyn's East New York neighborhood. He was arrested 5 times before he was 20 years old. He dropped out of school at 16. He was exactly the kind of man: street-born, violence comfortable, operationally aggressive, that Carlo Gambino had spent his entire organizational life managing and containing. Gotti joined the Gambino family as an associate in the early 1960s, working under Capo Carmine Fatico in the Bergin Hunt and Fish Club in Queens, a social club that served as the operational headquarters of Fatico's crew, and that Gotti would eventually take over and use as the base of his own operations. He was convicted of hijacking truck cargo from Kennedy Airport in 1968 and served 3 years in federal prison. He was convicted again in 1973 in a killing for which the circumstances were murky, but the organizational context was clear. The victim was a member of a rival faction whose kidnapping and murder of Gambino family member James McBratney in a Staten Island bar had required a commission-authorized response. Gotti served 2 years and returned to the streets as a made member of the family, his status within the organization elevated by the specific act. His prison time had demonstrated he was willing to commit. He rose through the Bergen crew's hierarchy with the speed that his combination of physical courage, organizational loyalty, and street-level charisma produced. He was not a sophisticated organizational manager in the Carlo Gambino sense. He was not patient, he was not invisible, and he was not inclined toward the kind of political calculation that Gambino had made the foundation of his leadership. He was the opposite of Gambino in almost every measurable dimension. He was flamboyant, he was visible, he was quoted, photographed, covered by the press with the enthusiasm that celebrity criminals generate. And he did not, as Gambino would have, take deliberate steps to reduce the visibility that made him a target. He cultivated it. The killing of Paul Castellano was the most audacious act in Gambino family history since the murder of Albert Anastasia nearly 30 years earlier. It was also, from an organizational standpoint, one of the most reckless. The Anastasia killing had been managed within the Commission's political architecture, facilitated in ways that produced Commission acquiescence, even if not Commission authorization. The Castellano killing was conducted without commission authorization, without the consultation that commission rules required before the murder of a sitting boss, and in circumstances, a public sidewalk in Midtown Manhattan in front of dozens of witnesses in one of the most surveilled blocks in New York City, that demonstrated a disregard for operational security that would have appalled Carlo Gambino. Gotti did not inform the commission. He presented it with a fact. He announced after the killing that Castellano had been removed because he was cooperating with federal prosecutors, a charge that subsequent investigation did not support, but that provided the organizational justification Gotti needed to present to the other commission families. He then declared himself boss of the Gambino family. The commission, faced with a fait accompli and lacking the institutional mechanism to reverse what had already happened, accepted his leadership. The Dapper Don, the nickname the press assigned to Gotti for his expensive suits, his styled hair, and his general effect of a man who was enjoying his own story, became the most publicly visible organized crime boss in American history. He appeared at public events. He attended the annual Feast of San Gennaro in Little Italy and shook hands with strangers. He held court at the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy, receiving capos, associates, and supplicants in a building that the FBI had under continuous surveillance, and into whose walls and ceiling they would eventually place listening devices of extraordinary sensitivity. He walked out of 3 federal trials in 1987, 1989, and 1990 through a combination of jury tampering, witness intimidation, and a natural courtroom charisma that genuinely played well in front of juries who found the government's witnesses less credible than the man they were accusing. The acquittals made him more dangerous to himself. Each one reinforced his conviction that he was beyond the reach of the federal prosecution apparatus, that his specific combination of organizational power, witness intimidation capacity, and personal charisma made him immune to the RICO prosecutions that had destroyed every other organized crime boss who had faced them. He told men around him that the government could not beat him. He held court at the Ravenite with a frequency and an openness that the surveillance photographs, hundreds of capos, made men, and associates arriving on Mulberry Street in a steady stream, visible to any observer, turned into documented evidence of the organizational structure the prosecution needed to establish for a RICO case. He was wrong about his immunity in the specific way that men who have survived multiple confrontations with institutional power tend to be wrong. He had confused surviving the previous challenges with being invulnerable to the next one. The federal prosecutors who built the case that eventually convicted him were not making the same arguments with the same evidence that the previous prosecutors had used. They had the Ravenite recordings, the recordings from listening devices placed in the Ravenite Social Club captured Gotti conducting organizational business with a specificity and a frankness that no previous surveillance of a sitting organized crime boss had produced. He discussed killings. He complained about subordinates by name and in terms that connected him to their activities. He made organizational decisions and stated them explicitly in conversation with the men he was deciding about. He conducted himself inside the Ravenite as a man who was certain that his walls were clean, a certainty that the FBI had rendered false and that would cost him everything. He complained about his underboss, Salvatore Gravano. He expressed frustration with Gravano's business activities and his organizational influence in terms that Gravano, when he heard the recordings during the prosecution's evidence preparation, understood immediately as a potential death sentence. A boss who complains about his underboss on a wiretapped recording is a boss whose underboss has two options: wait and be killed, or cooperate and be protected. Sammy Gravano chose to cooperate. Salvatore Sammy the Bull. Gravano was. By the time he made his decision to cooperate with the government in November 1991, the highest-ranking member of an American organized crime family ever to become a federal witness. He had been inducted into the Gambino family in the 1970s. He had risen through the organization's hierarchy to the position of underboss, the second in command, responsible for day-to-day operational management of the family's crews and for the organizational relationships that sustained its revenue operations. He had, by his own subsequent testimony, participated in 19 murders, as organizer, as participant, and as the specific triggerman in several of the killings his testimony described in detail. He made his decision in a conference room at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, where he and Gotti had been held since their arrest in December 1990. His lawyers communicated his willingness to cooperate to the federal prosecutors handling the case. The prosecutors understood immediately what they had: a cooperating underboss with personal knowledge of the full range of Gambino family operations across multiple decades, combined with the Ravenite recordings that his testimony could authenticate and contextualize, was the most powerful evidentiary combination that any organized crime prosecution had ever assembled. The cooperation agreement Gravano signed committed him to testify truthfully about everything he knew. The Gambino family's organizational structure, its revenue operations, its killing record, and specifically John Gotti's personal authorization of and participation in criminal activity including murder. In exchange, the government agreed to dismiss the murder charges that Gravano faced, the 19 killings his testimony would describe, and to pursue only the criminal enterprise charges that would result in a sentence the cooperation agreement's terms would substantially reduce. It was a transaction that generated at the time, and in the decades that followed, significant public and legal controversy. The government was offering a man who had participated in 19 murders a sentence that would allow him to walk free in 5 years, in exchange for testimony that would convict a man who had ordered murders, but whose direct personal participation in specific killings was more difficult to establish. The moral arithmetic was uncomfortable. The prosecutorial arithmetic was clear. Gravano's testimony would produce Gotti's conviction. Nothing else available to the prosecution would. The trial of John Gotti and his co-defendants began in January 1992 in the Eastern District of New York Courthouse in Brooklyn. The government's evidence included the Ravenite recordings, Gravano's testimony, and the accumulated investigative record of years of federal attention to the Gambino family's operations. Gravano took the stand and testified for 9 days. He described the Castellano murder, Gotti's planning of it, his observation of its execution, his declaration of himself as boss in its aftermath. He described the organizational structure of the family. He described specific meetings, specific decisions, specific conversations in which Gotti had explicitly connected himself to criminal activities that the recordings corroborated and elaborated. Gotti's defense attacked Gravano's credibility with the only argument available. He was a confessed murderer of 19 people whose testimony had been purchased with a sentence reduction that made his cooperation straightforwardly self-interested. The argument was accurate as a description of Gravano's situation. It was insufficient to produce a different verdict. John Gotti was convicted on all counts on April 2, 1992. he was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. He was transferred to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, one of the federal system's most restrictive facilities, where he was held in isolation for 23 hours a day. He developed throat cancer. He refused, initially, the treatment that might have extended his life, before eventually accepting it. He died in the federal prison hospital at Springfield, Missouri, on June 10, 2002, at the age of 61. He had been boss of the Gambino family for 6 years. In those 6 years, he had transformed a disciplined, institutionally embedded criminal organization into the most publicly visible organized crime operation in the country, walked out of 3 federal prosecutions on the strength of witness intimidation and personal charisma, and then conducted organizational business on listening devices his FBI investigators had installed in his own social club, while complaining about the underboss who would ultimately testify to his conviction. He was the most theatrical figure in the history of American organized crime. He was also measured against the standard Carlo Gambino had established, its most catastrophic failure of leadership. The prosecutions that followed Gotti's conviction reached through the Gambino family's organizational structure with a thoroughness that the commission cases of the 1980s had established as the new standard for organized crime prosecution. Acting boss John Gotti Jr., the convicted boss's son, who had taken a formal organizational position after his father's conviction, was himself prosecuted multiple times on RICO charges. He was tried 4 times between 1999 and 2006. 4 trials produced 4 hung juries. He eventually pleaded guilty to a narrower set of charges, served time, and was released. He has consistently maintained, in public statements made after his release, that he has left organized crime, the family's operational leadership, the network of capos and acting bosses who managed its revenue operations during the long period of prosecutorial pressure following Gotti's conviction, continued to generate revenue from the institutional sources that Gambino's architecture had embedded decades earlier: the construction industry connections, the waterfront operations, the gambling and loansharking that sustained crew-level revenues. These did not disappear with the conviction of any individual boss. They were institutional, embedded in relationships and organizational structures that individual prosecutions could damage but not eliminate. The federal prosecutorial attention that had been building since the early 1980s produced, across the 2 decades following Gotti's conviction, a sustained attrition of the family's organizational capacity. Successive acting bosses were identified, indicted, and convicted. Capos, whose operations generated sufficient investigative interest, were prosecuted. The accumulated weight of RICO prosecutions, informant cooperation agreements, and the specific intelligence that each cooperating witness provided about the next level of organizational structure above him created a sustained prosecutorial momentum that the family's institutional resilience, the quality that Gambino had spent 19 years building into its organizational architecture, was tested against continuously. The resilience was real, but not unlimited. The family that emerged from the post-Gotti prosecutorial period was smaller, less organizationally capable, and less institutionally embedded in New York's legitimate economic structures than the family Gambino had left at his death. The construction cartel had been dismantled by prosecution. The waterfront operations had been substantially disrupted by sustained law enforcement attention and the reorganization of the port's labor structures. The garment district operations had contracted with the garment industry's own decline as manufacturing moved offshore. The revenue streams that had sustained the family's institutional power at its peak were either gone or substantially diminished. What remained was the organizational structure, the hierarchy, the rules, the culture, and the street-level operations that had always provided the family's rank and file with their income. These proved more durable than the institutional revenue streams because they were distributed across dozens of individual crews, operating in ways that individual prosecutions could disrupt, but not eliminate simultaneously across the full organizational range. The Gambino family exists today. This is not a metaphorical statement or a speculative assessment. It is an organizational fact, confirmed by the consistent attention of federal law enforcement, which has continued to prosecute Gambino family members for crimes connected to the family's ongoing operations in the decades since John Gotti's conviction. The most recent federal indictments naming Gambino family members were filed within the past several years. The charges describe the same operational activities: loansharking, extortion, labor racketeering, gambling that have characterized the family's revenue operations since the middle of the 20th century. The family that persists is not the family that Carlo Gambino left. It is smaller, less powerful, less institutionally embedded, and more persistently prosecuted than anything Gambino managed or would have permitted. The organizational culture has degraded in ways that reflect the cumulative damage of 30 years of sustained federal attention, informant penetration, and the specific destruction that Gotti's leadership wrought on the institutional discipline that Gambino had spent decades building. The men who run the family today, to whatever degree its leadership can be said to run it in any coherent organizational sense, operate in an environment of prosecutorial pressure and informant risk that makes the sustained organizational management Gambino practiced essentially impossible to replicate. What has not changed is the fundamental proposition: the Gambino family's institutional durability, its survival through the Castellammarese War, through the commission prosecutions, through Gotti's catastrophic leadership, through Gravano's cooperation, through the sustained RICO prosecutorial campaigns of the 1990s and 2000s, reflects something about the organization's design that no amount of prosecution has fully reached. The design is not primarily organizational. It is cultural. The specific combination of Sicilian immigrant community values, the distrust of outside authority, the primacy of personal loyalty over institutional obligation, the code of silence, maintained not through explicit enforcement, but through deeply conditioned social expectation, that provided the Black Hand and the early American Mafia with their operational foundation also provided the Gambino family with an institutional resilience that organizational disruption alone could never eliminate. Carlo Gambino understood this. It was, in a sense, his deepest organizational insight, that the family's survival depended less on any specific organizational structure than on the cultural substrate from which its members were drawn and to which its practices appealed. He maintained that cultural connection through the specific care he took to ensure that the family remained embedded in the Sicilian American community structures that had produced it, and through the organizational discipline that reinforced those community values within the family's own institutional culture. The men who came after him understood it less well. Castellano drifted toward a corporate management style that disconnected the family's leadership from its cultural foundation. Gotti embraced the theatrical visibility that cultural foundation's values explicitly rejected. The consequences of both departures from Gambino's model, were catastrophic for the specific men who made them, and damaging for the institution they had inherited. Sammy Gravano walked free in 1995 after serving 5 years of his cooperation agreement sentence. He relocated, under a new identity, to Arizona. He was arrested in 2000 for running an ecstasy distribution ring in the Phoenix metropolitan area. He was convicted and sentenced to 20 years. He served the majority of that sentence and was released. He maintains a public profile, a podcast, social media presence, media interviews, in which he speaks life inside the Gambino family, his role in the Castellano murder, and his decision to cooperate with the government. He is, by any reasonable measure, the most consequential individual witness in the history of American organized crime prosecution. He is also a man who participated in 19 murders and served a combined total of approximately 12 years in prison. John Gotti's son, John Gotti Jr., lives in New York. About his experiences and has been the subject of biographical treatment. His father's name remains among the most recognizable in the history of American organized crime, a celebrity that the elder Gotti cultivated and that the family has never fully escaped. The Gambino family's name appears in federal indictments with a regularity that reflects both its organizational persistence and the sustained institutional attention of the federal law enforcement apparatus. Each indictment describes organizational activities consistent with the family's century-long operational history. Each conviction adds to the accumulated record of prosecutorial attention that has never eliminated what it has consistently disrupted. Carlo Gambino arrived in America in 1921 with a fake passport and an education in how power actually worked that no university in the world offered. He built, over the course of 50 years of patient organizational work, the most durable criminal institution in American history. He built it through personal discipline that left no prosecutable trace. He built it through organizational patience that outlasted every institutional response directed against it. He built it through a political intelligence that made him the dominant figure in American organized crime without ever making him its most visible one. He died in his bed. He was watching the Yankees. The family he built outlived him by decades and continues in some form today. The FBI investigated him for 30 years and never touched him. Federal prosecutors built cases against his successors and convicted them in succession. RICO dismantled the institutional revenue streams. Informants penetrated the organizational hierarchy. Surveillance technology recorded conversations that explicit organizational discipline had made impossible to produce for most of his tenure. None of it brought down what he built. Not completely. Not finally. The Gambino name is in this year's federal indictments. The quiet man from Palermo built something that America could damage and disrupt and partially dismantle across 5 decades of sustained institutional effort. He could not build something that would last forever. Nothing lasts forever. But he came close enough to forever that the distinction, for any practical purpose, barely matters. He watched the Yankees. He had a heart attack. He died in his own bed. No other man who built what he built can say the same.